If you compare the UK with any other country that has a higher tax burden than we do, all of them have higher taxes on average earners than we do. The tax burden sort of hovered around the 33, 34% of national income. It's now 38% of national income, and that is a historic change. Our welfare state was funded by long-term cuts in defence spending. One of the reasons, by the way, that I think the Americans do have a reasonable beef with the rest of the world.
Are we sort of stuck with the structure of the tax system that we have, or can we break free of it and get towards something better? Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Tom Clougherty, Executive Director here at the IEA, and today I'm delighted to be in conversation with Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies since 2011. He leaves this summer, but he's also got a book out in paperback format, Follow the Money. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the fiscal situation in Britain, some of the challenges the government is going to face come October. And we're going to talk about tax reform, pressures on public spending, and various other things besides. So before I get to it, let me just say, please subscribe to this channel and sign up for the IEA Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Paul, welcome to the IEA podcast.
Thank you.
So first question, pretty broad one. Now, you've been director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies since 2011. You've seen a lot of interesting things happen in fiscal policy over that time. You're stepping down this summer. But I'm curious, this is the big broad question. Over your now 14 years at the IFS, what do you think are the big macro trends in fiscal policy in Britain?
Obviously, I took over in 2011. That was in the aftermath of the financial crisis. We had a new coalition government in place, which was focused very much on getting down what was then had been the biggest deficit since the last war, as the world economy struggled through that financial crisis. So we saw through the 2010s a period of what became known as austerity, some pretty serious spending cuts over that period, as the government really wrestled the size of the state back down by 2019, effectively to where it had been at just before the financial crisis, at the end of 10 years of the previous Labour government. So I think that's a really important point to make. So there was genuine austerity in the sense there were genuine cuts across a range of public areas of public spending. Yet the size of the state by 2019 was the same as it had been in 2007. There was obviously an interruption in the middle of that from Brexit, which made things a little bit more difficult at the time. But really, you can think of that period up to 2019 as broadly a single period. So taxes over the period from 2019 to 2024 to today, in fact 2025, have grown dramatically as a fraction of national income. I mean, a historic change. 3 or 4% of national income increase in taxation as a fraction of national income, and an equivalent increase in public spending over that period. And we still have a very high deficit. And if you look at the debt, our debt, there are different measures of debt, but broadly speaking, it's around 100% of national income. And again, looking over a long period, we've come from 25 years ago, a period when we had one of the lowest debt, we were pretty much the lowest debt in the G7, and a pretty much average level of debt for OECD countries. We've now got debt way above the average for OECD and pretty much in the average for G7. So that's an indication that over that period, we broadly speaking run a looser fiscal policy than most other countries, which may come as a surprise to some people. But for instance, we spent far more through COVID and through the energy price crisis than many other countries, and we've struggled to bring the deficit down even in those years when we haven't been in crisis.
And Paul, I mean, looking particularly at the Conservative or Conservative-led governments that were in power over that period, most of that period at least, how would you regard their fiscal legacy? Have they got things to feel proud of? Have they got things that they should feel deeply ashamed about? What would be your take on that?
Well, the legacy is unquestionably a difficult one. Borrowing this year is still very elevated, and indeed was very elevated last year, the last year of the Conservative government. Now, there are also reasons for that. I mean, we've had a very torrid economic time with COVID and energy price increases and so on, as well as which are largely outside, obviously, the control of the last government. And rather surprisingly for Conservative government, they've left the size of the state much bigger than they found it, and they've left debt very, very much bigger than they found it. As I say, it'll be too harsh to say that was all down to them. There were unquestionably all sorts of circumstances outside of their control. I think if there's anything they should be ashamed of, I think obviously there was the trust debacle, but the more recent national insurance cuts by Jeremy Hunt, I thought were pretty cynical in a world in which he knew perfectly well that they were not consistent with any reasonable view of meeting his fiscal targets, which would have required staggeringly tight spending plans over the next few years. And we were given no sense from the government as to what they would cut to meet those plans. To be fair, though, the Labour Party signed up to that. They said they would keep the cuts in national insurance in place and were equally unwilling to be clear, shall we say, about the choices that they would make when they assumed office. In terms of what the Conservatives can be pleased about, I mean, I know that many people look back on austerity years as a failure, as an example of failure. I think we will be in a more difficult position had spending continued to increase over that period, had borrowing not at least become somewhat more under control. Because a large part of the difficult fiscal inheritance at the moment is just the very large level of debt and the very high levels of debt interest spending that the current government is facing. I think back in 2010, if you can cast your mind back that far, Labour and Conservatives were united, actually, in shame, really, in saying they wanted big cuts in investment and capital spending, which actually the coalition government largely implemented. But I think one of the things that they've been united, one can say they've both done rather well on more recently, has been that those capital budgets have risen quite fast. Philip Hammond and Sajid Javid and others under the Conservatives actually increased capital spending when under fiscal pressure, and Rachel Reeves has done much the same. That's very much in contrast to what Chancellor's past would have done and certainly did.
Mm. And I mean, I think there's something that you've pointed to possibly in your Times column about the Conservative legacy, which perhaps a rather strange or counterintuitive one. But that when you look at what actually happened to the tax system, Conservatives seem to have made it very much more progressive. And in fact, they seem to have hammered the better off in a way that is sort of at odds with their political reputation. And that probably goes for higher paid public sector workers as well as, private sector taxpayers as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know it will probably strike some people as odd.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to make. I mean, I don't make this with any sort of political judgment in mind, but I think it's really important to make the point because obviously the Conservatives don't want to tell you that because, as you say, it's rather counter to their brand. And Labour certainly don't want to tell you that the Conservatives were hammering the rich because they're sort of more in the market for claiming they're going to do that themselves. But the Conservative governments really did hammer the rich and companies as well. So if you look at the share of income tax paid by the top 1%, that rose from about 25% to about 30% over the period. And this time that was not because the highest income people got richer. They didn't actually much over that period. That's because the tax system became much more progressive. So we've been paying the 45p rate now comes in at 125,000. In cash terms, that's 25,000 less than where the top rate came in 2010. And so we've got, I can't remember the numbers, a huge increase in numbers of people paying at that rate. We've still got the 60p rate coming in at 100 thousand. There's been big cuts in pension tax relief for the very highest earners. And actually, again, the Conservatives were much more effective at clamping down on the more egregious tax avoidance schemes than was the government over the 2000s. On top of that, we've got record receipts from corporation tax. That's a different issue. But it's and if you look at, whilst the tax burden as a whole is at its highest level essentially ever, the direct tax burden on people on average earnings isn't. In fact, it's well below where it's been over the last 20 or 30 years. So looks at from the point of view of direct taxes, it was remarkably progressive. You might call sort of almost socialist government for the 15 years up to 2024. And I'm hammering the point home because no one else will tell you that's what happened.
No, absolutely. And I suppose that feeds into another point that I know you've made quite well in the past, that if you assume, and obviously those of us at the IEA may take a different view on this, but if you assume that the spending pressures are there, they're only going to get bigger, that public spending is going to rise, and that debt is going to remain expensive or become more so. And I mean, of course, you can look at an aging population, you can look at the demand to spend more on defence and a host of other things. It's quite reasonable for people to suggest that public spending pressures are going to continue to grow, even if from a small state standpoint, we might not like that very much. So if people say, well, look, taxes are going to go up, whatever happens, I think you've made the point in the past, you're not going to just get it from rich people. And you're not just going to get it from a handful of companies that no one likes very much anyway. And I don't want to, misstate your viewpoint. I'll let you make the point for yourself. But am I right in thinking that you would suggest if we need more money, it's going to have to come from those big, broad-based taxes on more or less average earners, income tax, national insurance, VAT?
I think broadly speaking, that's right. If we really do want significantly more tax, and that's partly because most of the rises that we've had have come from elsewhere, from companies and higher earners. If you compare the UK with any other country that has a higher tax burden than we do, all of them have higher taxes on average earners than we do. Pretty much. I mean, there may be one or two exceptions that I'm not aware of, but broadly speaking, that is the case. And my guess, I mean, again, let me hammer home this point about the tax burden in the UK. It is from all of my life, and I'm afraid, I was born in the 1960s. For all of my life, the tax burden sort of hovered around the 33, 34% of national income. Sometimes there's some cyclical changes. It's now 38% of national income, and that is a historic change. And I honestly would be surprised if it ever goes back down in the rest of my lifetime to where it was for all of my lifetime up till 2020. And as you say, the pressures are in the other direction, given aging populations, demands for public services, and poor economic growth as well is clearly part of the issue here. So if we do need more, I think it will be the broad-based taxes. This month, we're recording this in April. This is the 50th anniversary of a fiscal event, Dennis Healey's 1975 budget. That is the last time, 1975, that the basic rate of income tax was increased. Dennis Healey increased it from 33 to 35%. Every move in the basic rate of income tax since then has been down. Now, that's not true of any other tax that I can think of. But he also increased in that. It's 1975 budget is very exciting from a fiscal nerd point of view, but he increased all of the rates of income tax by 2%, so to 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, and so on. But he didn't increase the 83% rate to 85%, because with a 15% surcharge, that would have taken the top rate to 100. And even in the 1970s, 100% was considered beyond the pale.
Even then, yeah. But of course, we do have, close to or exceeding 100% rates on some earners at some points in the income distribution, right? So especially at that £100,000 barrier. Now, equally, we can say maybe compared with other countries, people on average earnings, at least in terms of direct taxes, are reasonably well treated by the British tax system. There does seem to have been a kind of unpersoning of people who earn 100,000 or more in the Treasury, to the point that it's like, well, we just forget about them. We forget that they have incentives, that they probably have financial needs as well, and basically we can just load whatever we want at that sort of symbolic income threshold.
Yeah, I think unpersoning of people over 100,000. I hadn't heard that before. I love that, and I'll use that.
You're welcome, Tim Paul.
I think there is some truth there. I mean, the particular sort of issues around that threshold is not only that you move from paying 42% income tax of 40 and NI of 42 to 62%. You've got a 62% income tax rate between 100 and 125,000. But you also lose, if you've got children, you lose all of the childcare support. So there are some calculations suggest that if you've got a couple of kids who are eligible for childcare, then you need to move from about 100,000 to about 140,000. Otherwise, if you earn anything in between, you're worse off, which is absurd. You've also got very high rates of tax or withdrawal on people on 60,000s because of withdrawal of child benefit. For much higher earners, withdrawal of pension tax relief also creates very high effective tax rates. And as you say, the 100,000 mark has become this mark of we don't really care about anyone over that. We're actually now at the position where we've got about the same fraction of people with incomes over 100,000 as 30 years ago we had with incomes over the higher rate threshold. So 100,000 has sort of become the new higher rate threshold. So the point at which you start to pay 40%. Now, of course, that's 50,000 or thereabouts, and we've got record numbers of people paying that. I mean, the higher rate tax level is almost becoming the new basic rate because so many people are being dragged into it. So we have really dramatically, and I think without anyone admitting it or defending it particularly, we've dramatically altered the shape of our income tax system. So whilst the basic rate is 20%, it's the lowest it's certainly been post-war. We have, well, I'm not sure if that's true actually, but anyway, certainly though it's been for a very long time. We have increasing numbers of people paying at 40%, and all of these oddities which have been introduced. That I think over 100,000 was introduced by the last Labour government, but a lot of the oddities have been introduced by the more recent Conservative governments.
I mean, do you worry, as I do, I think, about the political economy of the tax system that we have at the moment? Not just that the policies themselves are wrong or bad in many cases, but that actually the incentives are set up in such a way that it's very difficult to reform your way out. So I guess the problem here that I'm pointing to is the more and more you rely on income from the highest earners, the more and more incentive you have to just try and go after them more. So if you have an aging population, you have low growth, and you need more tax revenue as a result. All the political incentives point towards taxing the easy targets. So the rich people, companies, maybe going after savings and investment income rather than, labour income and that kind of thing, or maybe lumping more money on stamp duty on foreigners, which is something that we've seen repeatedly in recent years, including from Conservatives, of course. Is there a danger here that, yes, people will say we need more revenue, but they keep going after it in the wrong ways? And then maybe you get into this vicious cycle where you want to raise money, so you raise taxes, but you raise the wrong taxes and they have a growth impact, and then you're sort of in as bad or worse a position and kind of rinse and repeat. This is a rather long-winded way of asking, Paul, I'm sorry. Are we sort of stuck with the structure of the tax system that we have, or can we break free of it and get towards something better?
Well, some recent history would suggest that you're right. I mean, if you look at the tax rises we've had, I mean, I am, anyone who's ever heard me speak before will know that I loathe stamp duty with a passion. I really do think it's just about the most destructive tax that we have. And yet chancellors just keep putting it up. Conservative, Labour chancellors and Conservative chancellors. And it's just, the most awful tax from the point of view of mobility, growth, the labour, the housing market, just about everything. if you look at the big tax rises in recent years, I mean, we can point to 3 or 4 of them. Rise in the rate of corporation tax to 25%. So corporation tax take, I think, to the surprise and astonishment of many of us who've been working this area for a long time, is at its highest level ever, where we're getting more from corporation tax than we have ever got, despite all of the projections that it would run to zero as international competition took hold. We've had, so that was under the Conservatives. The Labour Party, of course, have increased employer national insurance, because that doesn't appear in your pay packet directly, but it clearly has effects on pay and unemployment. And the other route we've used for increasing taxes is by using a lot of fiscal drag, by holding all of those thresholds and allowances stable in cash terms, which is obviously dragging lots more people into income tax and into higher rates of income tax and into that over £100,000 mark. So those are the ways that we've gone about it. And of course, you've got the ever-present rhetoric of we're going to protect working people, where I think working people effectively means people who are in work but earning less than some amount, which is certainly well below 100,000. And if you're really going to raise taxes and not affect that group, then you are focusing on the sorts of people that you're describing.
Mm. I mean, so Paul, I was just looking again at your book, Follow the Money, which came out in 2023, I think, but you had a new paperback edition, revised and updated last year. And I really recommend it to listeners to this podcast. It's an excellent book, fantastic overview of where the money comes from and where it goes and some of the problems inherent in both of those things. One of the things that I think is striking as I read through it, and my own personal area of research focus is tax policy. And people might think, well, here's the director of the IFS writing, here's the director of the IEA reading. Surely they'll have very different views about the kind of tax system that we ought to have and the kind of tax reforms that would be desirable. And though I could obviously nitpick and find a handful of things that I don't 100% agree with, I think actually the overwhelming message that I would get is, this is all very sensible. This is kind of standard or classic economic thinking. And that, whether you're, broadly in the center, whether you're more on the free market end of the spectrum, actually, if you approach tax in an economically minded way, you're led in more or less the same direction. You may disagree, I suppose, on exactly where the level of tax should be. But when you look at the kind of reforms that you want, and it's things like, tax relief for savings so you don't have double taxation, broadening the VAT base so you don't have all of these ludicrous complexities that you have at the moment, merging income tax and national insurance, partly to stop politicians from being able to con us so easily, but also to deal with some of the distortions, the lack of neutrality that taxing different things differently introduces. Would you sort of share that assessment that economists almost across the spectrum, not quite the full spectrum, but can agree on the principles of tax reform? And if that's the case, why is it so difficult to get anywhere?
Very good question. I think you're broadly right. I mean, most economists who have thought about tax would, I think, broadly accept the things that you've just described, that it would be more sensible to have a broader VAT base. Sorry to repeat the things that you're saying. The stamp duty is a terrible tax, that we need to reform the taxation of housing, that we should treat self-employment and employment and corporate income much more similarly to get to, so we don't make avoidance so easy. And all of those sorts of things. And obviously, people have disagreements about the philosophy behind, for example, an inheritance tax, or, as you say, how much tax you want to raise. But I think the very large majority of economists who have looked at tax, and not just in this country, but actually around the world. So there have been reviews of this in the US, in Australia, in Europe, and so on. And the broad themes are generally pretty similar. I think the barriers to change are the obvious political ones. Any significant reform, unless you're going to throw money at it, is going to leave some people significantly worse off. And whichever group that is, they're going to kick back at that. So, I mean, think about changing VAT, broadening the base. Now, obviously, if all you do is stick a whole load of VAT on food, you're going to make poor people significantly worse off. But actually, the biggest is actually better off people who pay a lot more of it because they buy more expensive food. They spend more on food. There's plenty of money there to redistribute, to leave less well-off people no worse off on average. And the same is true in spades for domestic energy consumption, which we currently, particularly if it's gas, we effectively subsidize because, despite the fact we're supposedly keen on net zero, because unlike most other goods, we've only got a 5% VAT rate on domestic gas. There's lots of additional charges on electricity, which is actually much greener than gas. So there's a kind of absolutely absurd sort of elements of the system there. But we never make changes to undo it because it's politically hard. And actually, I'm old enough to remember Norman Lamont trying to do that back in the early 1990s. He tried to put VAT at the full rate on domestic fuel with a big compensation package. It was staggeringly unpopular. It was one of the things I think which precipitated the for a nearly 20-year period fatal decline in Conservative support, despite it being something that, broadly speaking, I think most of us, at least ivory tower economists, would think was a broadly sensible thing. Because, of course, there will always be losers. If you are on a low income and have a big, hard-to-heat house, the compensation is not going to be enough to compensate you. You will be someone on low income who's worse off. But the important thing very often to think about is what is the counterfactual? We are often in tax, I think, stuck with where we start. So if we started with VAT on fuel and then someone suggested getting rid of it on domestic energy, someone suggested getting rid of it, people go crackers because you've been giving most of that money to rich people in big houses heating their swimming pools, which is essentially what we're doing at the moment. We don't think of it like that because we're starting off with a different status quo. So in my book, I think I refer to the tyranny of the status quo when it comes to tax policy. But it's very deeply rooted in people's psychology. People value a loss much more than people value a gain. And so anything which creates losses is very, very hard to achieve, unless, to your earlier point, it's the unpersoned who are on higher income.
So you mentioned there, Paul, the tyranny of the status quo. And I mean, you see that a lot in tax policy. I wonder, is there also a sense in which the way we make tax policy in Britain is part of the problem? This cycle of fiscal events and tax policy as an act of political theatre, rather than anything sort of longer term, thought out, carefully planned, and so on.
Yes, I think there is. It's astonishing when you look across government policy. Most bits of government have strategies coming out of their ears. There's always a strategy for schools or for education. There's always a health strategy for 2035, or an environment strategy, or whatever. There has never, literally never been a tax strategy, and you can kind of see it in the way that governments and chancellors behave. 1 year they're cutting corporation tax, and the next year they're increasing corporation tax. 1 year they're increasing tax allowances, the next year they're cutting them, and those are the kind of big high level things. But in the details, you've got things changing in different directions all of the time, and this is genuinely damaging. We at the IFS held a conference last week for essentially senior tax practitioners, and we sort of at the end of it ran a little one of these little surveys about what people most wanted from corporation tax, and the overwhelming answer was we just want some stability and certainty. It wasn't sort of we want big cuts or we want big reform. It's just tell us what's going to happen. And this matters to individuals as well. One of the most damaging aspects, which I suspect will happen again this year, of the run up to last year's budget, was lots of speculation about will there be cuts to pension tax relief, and lots of people actually changed their behaviour because they thought there might be, and there wasn't. which is fine. But the Chancellor didn't say anything about it. She didn't say, as I think she should have done under those circumstances, and we're going to keep this as it is for the next 5 years. And she didn't say, we've got a strategy to achieve this. She was just silent. Now, my guess is that the Chancellor's going to want to raise a bunch more money in the next budget. My guess is there's going to be a bunch more speculation about this and a bunch more damage created because we have literally no idea what this government's view is about pension tax relief. And I just use that as an example because it's a very salient and obvious one where the uncertainty creates measurable and genuine problems for individuals, and where a lot of that problem is created by a total vacuum when it comes to sense of direction.
So you've brought us bang up to date there, Paul. I mean, what do you think the Chancellor is going to face in October? Now, you'll have left the IFS by that point, but I'm sure you still have a view. I mean, it sounds like the fiscal headroom, the sacred 9.9 billion that was there on Spring Statement Day was gone about a week or so later. Things may improve by October. I suppose they may not. What challenge do you think the government is going to face, and how do you think they'll respond? And I'm not really asking you to make a political prediction there, but I suppose you've been around these debates for long enough to know what are the go-to things that people reach for when you're running up to a budget and you've got a fiscal hole and you have to plug it somehow. Pension tax relief comes up every single year, at least once or twice. There are other things like that as well. I mean, what's your sense of what's coming down the track?
Oh, if only I knew. I mean, we're recording this, it's worth being clear, slightly less than a week after Donald Trump's Liberation Day, which appears to have liberated absolute chaos in the financial markets and in terms of tariff wars and so on. So goodness knows where we're going to be come the autumn. It is worth saying that there is a very, in terms of what the government might do, there is, in terms of the fiscal rules, there is a very clear get-out clause, which is in the, I can't remember what exactly what it says. Basically, it says in the event of fiscal calamity, we can we'll ignore these rules because they won't apply, which is perfectly sensible. I mean, we may still be in the throes of economic calamity or even worse calamity than looks at the moment. So I'm not being very cheerful, am I? But it really does. It's just so staggering what's going on at the moment that it's hard to think about anything else right now. And so, there's lots of different scenarios for the autumn, one of which is that the world economy is in a deep recession. And then all bets are off, I think. You may well need, and this is where things get really hard, the government may well make the judgment, as it did during the financial crisis, as it did during COVID, that the economy needs a whole load more spending or even tax cuts to see it through a very difficult period. They could alternatively take the judgment that this isn't a cyclical downturn, that this is a long-term, we're all poorer because of the actions of President Trump into the long run. Now, that's a much harder position, because if that's what you think, then you maybe you need to cut your cloth and say the state's going to spend less. Now, that's tough. That's really tough, particularly because we've got the spending review in June, well before the autumn budget. Or you might decide that we need to raise more tax to cover the spending that we're committed to, in which case taxes yet again ratchet upwards in the face of a change in economic circumstances. So actually, I'm not going to answer your question, because I think the levels of uncertainty are so dramatic now that pretty much everything is on the table. I rather suspect. I mean, I hope to goodness that the world has and President Trump has come to his senses by then and things have calmed down. But if that hasn't happened, and there's a very significant probability that it won't have happened, then we might need big change, big tax rises, or big spending cuts if we think this is a permanent thing, or it may be big fiscal support in the short run with promises of austerity later on. I mean, these are tough times.
You talked about cutting your cloth there as government, the possibility of trying to spend less. Now, I know that your long-term view is that, and in fact, you've said it on this podcast already, that you don't think the state as a share of GDP is going back where it was in your lifetime, that we're going to have a bigger state and elevated spending. But if, let's say, the government decided, I'm not sure how likely this is, that they were going to cut their cloth, that they were going to try and row back on state spending. Is it possible? Do you see areas where efficiencies, really there have to be a lot more than efficiencies at this point, don't they, could be made? What kind of things would we be talking about if you were in that very constrained fiscal environment and they decided that the spending side of the equation was the one that was going to bear the strain?
Well, it's hard, isn't it? I mean, it's worth just starting with a little bit of history here. I mean, in many ways, it's worth looking. It was extraordinary that for so long the state didn't get bigger as health spending particularly carried on up and welfare spending rose and so on. And it's worth understanding how that happened. I mean, part of it, of course, and this is really pertinent today, a big part of it was big cuts in defence spending over a long period of time. So to a large extent, our welfare state was funded by long-term cuts in defence spending. One of the reasons, by the way, that I think the Americans do have a reasonable beef with the rest of the world, which is that we funded our welfare state while they funded defence. So that's one part of it. I mean, if you look sort of back over the sort of 70s and so on, the state just withdrew from things like building houses and running nationalised industries. If you look at the 2010s, then you had state withdrawing from funding parts of higher education and a real squeeze across the piece. So we've got examples of how things have worked in the past. Now, clearly, defence spending ain't going down. In fact, it's probably going up. That creates a real issue because health spending ain't going down. It hasn't anywhere in the world that I'm aware of. I think the only way we would get public health spending down would be probably some sort of significant co-payment or private sector element to our health service, which seems entirely beyond what's any chance of happening, and probably create quite a lot of inefficiency along the way. So where else do you get cuts in spending? Well, let's look where are the big spending. So biggest spending is health. It's quite hard to see how you cut health. It's not as if our health service is doing a great job at the moment. Nothing is. It's a long way from perfect. There are unquestionably ways of making it more efficient, but big savings, I don't think so. Second biggest is spending on benefits for pensioners. Well, we do spend a lot on benefits for pensioners, though way below the average even less than they do in the US. So you could get rid of the triple lock. There's obviously going to have to happen at some point. Save you a bit into the medium term. Maybe you could start means testing the state pension. I don't think actually that would be a good idea. It's actually quite important for most people as a basis for their retirement income. You've then got working age welfare. The big and fast growing part of that is spending on disability and incapacity benefits, which the government made a small move towards controlling recently. It's worth saying what they've done is slightly reduce the speed of expected increase in spending on those benefits, not actually cut them. So you could go further there, but again, that would be difficult both politically and for some of the people affected. So what's the next biggest budget? What's the education budget across schools and universities and so on? Cut teachers' pay, get students to pay even more of their fees. Difficult, I suppose, might be possible. Then you've got defence, where we've just agreed that needs to go up. Spending on local government and social care. They've already had the biggest cuts of pretty much anywhere over the last few years. And then you're into the small departments. It's a long way. It's a very long-winded way of saying if you wanted to make big cuts, I don't know how you would do it.
And then I suppose the focus would have to be, leaving aside all the headwinds that the economy might be facing, going for economic growth and trying to grow the pie rather than shrinking the share you're taking of it. I think right at the end of your book, Follow the Money, you talk about the point of this book is not laying out a pro-growth strategy or anything, but you do touch on some of the big things that you think would need to happen for us to get growth going in Britain again. And worth saying, we've had pretty much dire economic performance since 2010. Average earnings and stuff barely increasing, productivity really flat over that period. So, I mean, just outline for us, and maybe even prioritize for us, what are the things that you think we would need to do to improve our economic performance in the long run?
Well, to some extent, we know the answer to that, and one of the things I say in my book is that there's a conspiracy really in Whitehall, which is that we do know what to do and we decide not to. Though, I mean, and to some extent, to be fair to this government, they have been starting to break that conspiracy of silence. So we know that building runways and airports would be good for growth. We've up till now decided not to do that. We know that tax reform will be good to growth. Well, when we've talked about that, that seems unlikely to happen. And indeed, this government has decided to do a very anti-growth increase in taxes. We know that planning reform will be good for growth. And again, to be fair to this government, they are doing something significant, though in my view, not significant enough in terms of liberalising planning rules. There's unquestionably more to do on sort of things like the Oxford-Cambridge Arc and Corridor that have been that's been talked about on science and R&D type funding. So there's a whole host of things where we kind of know, we don't just kind of know, I mean, we do know that things will be good for growth. I mean, if we're going to increase spending on defence, we need to get better at spending that the money in ways that are really effective and happen quickly. We need to make our regulatory bodies and competition regulation more effective than it is. And we might need to think about whether it makes sense to stop all exploration in the North Sea. If we're in favour of net zero, it's not obvious that it helps simply to import our oil rather than produce it. We're clearly making ourselves poorer. Are we helping the climate? It's not entirely obvious that we are. So there's a whole series of things there. All of these things have trade-offs. I mean, clearly, people don't. I mean, one of the most positive things I've heard any politician say actually was, oddly enough, Keir Starmer at the last Labour Party conference. He kind of acknowledged that on planning there are trade-offs. And he basically said, if we have to drive a motorway through your back garden, well, tough. You didn't quite say that. But I think that is the sort of attitude that you sort of, to a degree, are going to need if you're really going to focus on growth.
Yeah. And I mean, have you detected any shift among policymakers? I mean, I guess maybe you see a little bit with what you just said with Keir Starmer saying these kind of pro-growth things to a Labour Party conference. But are we just sort of rehashing the same arguments that we've had before? And are we kind of repeating the same mistakes? Or is there anything, this will be the last question, Paul, that gives you a sense of optimism that things maybe are moving in the right direction? If we know the right kind of tax reforms, if we know the right kind of regulatory reforms, does anything give you faith that they're actually going to happen now?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, this government is talking a better game than I've heard from governments for quite a long time, in terms of what it's saying about all of the things we've just described. Planning, regulation, the importance of growth, all of those things. You look at what it's actually done up till now, much less positive. I mean, even as it's talking about a bonfire of the quangos, it's talking about putting more in place to regulate employment and business. Even as it's talking about reducing regulation, it's putting additional regulation into the housing market, into the employment market, and so on. So they need to do what they say they'll do. But the planning reforms, whilst, as I say, not going as far as I think we need to, are going further than we've seen in the past. There's a willingness, it seems, to take some political flack for that. So I've got, and again, and just to repeat my point, we have a government that says it's focused on growth and chooses a very ungrowth friendly increase in taxation on employer national insurance. So the rhetoric is much stronger than and the plans are much stronger than the actuality so far. But I am encouraged by I think they mean it when they say that they're really focused on making changes.
Well, Paul, it's always nice to finish on a somewhat upbeat note.
About as upbeat as I get, I'm afraid.
But thank you for joining us. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and all the best of luck with your move away from the IFS and towards Oxford. But I will see you again. Cheers.